Executive Officer of Netflix.
Thank you. Panels are always more interesting when you mix it up and argue a little bit. So I'll pick a fight with Jim. And I think most of what he said was wrong. That when you focus on 5-year revolutions, you probably fail to create 50-year evolutions. And that I don't believe that it's true in 5 years we will have changed everything. And I believe that if you set up your goal structures and energy loops around the expectation that in 5 years we're going to make a phenomenal difference, it's just not what happens in the world, and I'll give you many examples. In the early 1960s, there was a lot of conferences like this about the incredible advent of the new technology that was going to transform education, television, and television was going to open things up in this country, and we were going to have learning all the time, and families by the TV, and this whole period, 1960 to 1965. And, you know, well, some stuff came out of it. Sesame Street, that's a great one. But, you know, it's like small waves of things. And so, you know, when we're in the middle of the iPhone and everything's changing very fast, it's easy to get caught up in it. And some of the aspects are harder to deliver than others. It takes a lot of time. Think about it as there's really two big segments. There's the parent pay segment, and there's the government pay segment, meaning our K-12 schools. Okay, and they really have very different properties. In the parent pay segment, you know, you've got a lot of innovation. You get things like Disney's Baby Einstein that's, you know, been in the press lately, and, you know, and you get a little toy learning, and then what happens is we find higher socioeconomic families adopt a lot of those things more quickly, and in fact, the gap is widened, and that is true. And then in some conferences, we spend a lot of time thinking about, we got to close the gap, we got to close the gap. Well, it ain't going to happen. I mean, these are economics that are driving it, you know, who are the cutting edge, which is, I think we need to shift our expectations around, you know, families that are in the parent pay segment are the first adopters of these technologies. And then what happens is the prices come down and they become widespread. Okay, and they're the audience that can pay the high margins to get some of this stuff developed. Let me give you another example. When cars were first coming out, there was the transportation gap. Okay, because only high-end people had cars. And then, you know, more and more people had them. And then, you know, now everybody has a car, okay, in America. Another one is computers. I mean, 10 or 15 years ago, it was computer gap, the digital gap, you know, and now we got netbooks at, you know, $200 and $300. You know, Verizon has one at $99. And, you know, the prices come down and the gap lessens. So think of the gap in these is real. Okay, and it's because you need an early audience that can pay more because it's a less efficient system and it's at less scale. Then these things get to very large scale and the benefits go out to a very wide group of people. And it's not that there may not be role for government at various times, but the gap is a natural part of the evolution of technology. Technology has a beachhead in which it works well, then it gets a little broader. Cell phone is another one. You know, probably some of you remember 1986 and Michael Douglas on the beach with this, you know, big brick cell phone, and, you know, 10 years later it's a StarTAC, and, you know, it's still pretty big, and, you know, then in 10 years after that, in 06, you know, it's a fairly little phone, can fit in your pocket, and now it's an iPhone. So it's, you know, really just tremendous progress, and technology does continue to deliver those benefits. Now, that's in the parent pay sector, okay? And that sector you should think of as going to be more and more of learning because it's deregulated. It's up to all kinds of entrepreneurs to come up with, you know, what is Sesame Street on the web crossed with Facebook? You know, all kinds of people will try all kinds of things. Some of it will be for pay. Some of it will be free. Some of it will be Wikipedia. And I think that sector will flourish in innovation even if this room does little. Okay? Because there's just so much energy around it. I think it's a great place to put in philanthropic dollars. I think it's a great place to put in venture capital dollars, of this whole informal, out of the grammar of K-12. Personally, most of my focus is still in K-12, not because it's the high efficacy way to address this problem, because I think it may turn out to be the low efficacy way. But, you know, you've got this huge, again, parent pay market. On the government pay market, the problem is it's so highly regulated, so highly controlled, that many of us spend lots of time trying to figure out how to help districts. And the normal cycle is this. Oh my gosh, Joel Klein is so amazing. Look at the progress he's doing. Let's work with him. Let's build this up. And it feels so good. And we can turn around and you see school districts can work and the millions of kids and look at the results. And then 10 or 15 years later, post-Bloomberg, post-Klein, you come back and it's like, wow, it's regressed to the mean. Okay, so in this state, in California, Roy Romer in LA, we did a lot of work with him, had a tremendous run. Most of it's fallen apart since then. I mean, 10 or 15 years ago, Seattle was a really hot district. You know, they were making all this change of budgeting and, you know, everyone, now it's, so what happens? Why does it like regress to the mean? What is that? Why is it happening? I think the fundamental problem is the difference between self-perpetuating governance and elected governance. So you all are in for-profits or nonprofits, and your board selects other board members. That's self-perpetuating governance. And what it leads to is reasonable continuity and vision. On the other hand, in a public school district, you have elected school board or elected mayor, and sometimes there's good people there organized on the same vision, and sometimes not. And my theory is, if Microsoft or Google or GE or Netflix had publicly elected boards, then the companies like Google would operate as poorly as school districts because the leadership every 10 years, very different directions. And conversely, if school districts didn't have that, they could execute well. So I think a lot of the time that we spend improving school districts, we're really pushing a rubber band because, you know, if there's 1,000 school districts of large school districts, you know, at some point in time, you know, at any point in time, a dozen or two of them are going to have great, incredible leaders like Michelle Rhee and Joel Klein, and God bless them, they're making, you know, doing great work. But the problem is there's no way in the elected system to keep a consistent evolution. If you look at GE, consistently good leaders over, you know, 100 years, and that's how they work. Look at P&G. You don't get any of that because you don't have self-perpetuating governance. So the fundamental problem, it's not the same issue as communism and capitalism, but you would probably easy to understand that if there's a communist country, it's really hard to improve agricultural productivity. I mean, you could teach them fertilizer practices, but it's not going to make much difference, okay? Now, our school districts are not communist, okay, but they have a fundamental governance problem, which is the equivalent of communism and capitalism. The governance problem is elected school boards. And when you get elected school boards, you get no consistent vision. And every 10 years, and you know what? If you worked in a system where every 10 years the direction kept moving back and forth, or every other superintendent was good and every other superintendent was adult, then, you know, you'd probably want a thick union contract too. You know, and you wouldn't be such a fan of merit pay. So, you know, all of these responses that teachers have, I think, are very legitimate responses to the management world in which they live in, which is, you know, sometimes they have good superintendent and often not. And then from the not good superintendent comes all kinds of other problems. So that ultimately comes back to this self-perpetuating governance. Now, the problem was saying, oh, well, that's interesting, Reed. Okay, let's take the Mountain View School District and make it self-perpetuating governance. Well, now the problem is it's a monopoly. You know, it owns the whole Mountain View area and is self-perpetuating, and suppose it gets broken. Well, there's no, you know, it's going to run the schools forever, even horribly. Well, that doesn't sound good. In fact, what you have with self-perpetuating is then you need some competition. You need multiple providers. We have multiple foundations in this room and in the US, and sometimes a foundation gets pretty broken. The board, you know, the average momentum on the board is not good. I'm out of time here. So, but then there's other foundations that step in. Military branches. It always used to bother me that we have, I mean, why do we have so many military branches? And then I realized, oh, because they're self-perpetuating, you got to have a mechanism where if the Army gets really, you know, in a mess, you know, the other guys can pick up a lot of the mission. And that, in fact, having multiple providers with each one being self-perpetuating is the recipe in the military, it's the recipe in the nonprofit side, it's the recipe in politics. The Democrats and Republicans pick their own in a lot of things. And that's what we don't have in schools. And I think this issue, as subtle as it is as deep as capitalism versus communism. And that if you get the fundamental model wrong at the top, then, helping with better fertilizer for agricultural productivity is, not very productive. And so one of the reasons I believe that then is I'm working on charter management organizations, as lots of people in this room are, which are self-perpetuating organizations that compete. So what I hope to see happen over the next 20 years is that CMOs will grow rapidly. Now, for a CMO to grow rapidly, it must be a technology leader, and this is where it comes together. If some CMO breaks out at rapid pace, that's because it's going to use technology so aggressively that it gets twice the learning at half the price, and then can use the margins to put up new buildings and new buildings and new buildings. Because if they do it like KIP does, which I'm on the board of, it's God's work, but it's unbelievably labor intensive. And going to 1,000 schools, is very hard. Whereas if you can use technology to get the same benefits that KIP does now, but at much lower cost, then the CMO side will be able to really expand. So that would be my idea of what will happen over the next 10 or 20 years. And I'm out of time, so I'll hand this over.